September 17, 1862. Dawn, a cornfield outside Sharpsburg, Maryland. More than 1,000 Union soldiers crept forward through the corn. The stalks were at head level, shielding their movement. They could not see what was waiting for them. 200 yards ahead, Confederate soldiers from Georgia lay flat on their stomachs in the dirt. They had their rifles leveled. They were watching, waiting. The moment the Union troops emerged from the corn, the Georgians rose up as one and fired. The entire first line of Union soldiers felt like they had been cut down by a scythe. The survivors pressed forward into a wall of lead. The smoke, the noise, the artillery crashing in from all directions, concentrated terror. Over the next 12 hours, that cornfield would change hands 15 times. Men would charge into it and never come out. The corn would be cut down not by farmers, but by bullets. The ground would become so thick with bodies that soldiers could not walk without stepping on the dead. That cornfield was just one small piece of the battlefield. Across these fields, through these woods, down these sunken roads, men would fight and die all day long, from dawn until sunset, 12 straight hours of killing. By nightfall, 23,000 men would be dead, wounded, or missing, more American casualties than D-Day, more than Pearl Harbor, more than the September 11th attacks, all in one day. September 17, 1862, remains the bloodiest single day in American history. This is the story of Antietam, the day 23,000 men vanished in 12 hours. Welcome, friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. When people talk about the deadliest battles of the Civil War, they usually mention Gettysburg. 51,000 casualties over 3 days, the turning point of the war, but there was a day that was worse. A single day where more men fell than on any other day in American military history. A day where the killing was so intense, so concentrated that when the sun set, both armies were too exhausted to continue. The Battle of Antietam. It is sometimes forgotten in the shadow of Gettysburg, but it was just as important, perhaps more so. It stopped Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. It gave Abraham Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It changed the entire character of the war, and it produced casualties at a rate that has never been matched in American warfare. Nearly 2,000 men falling every hour for 12 straight hours. Today we are going to tell the story of that day. The story of the cornfield where men disappeared into the smoke. The story of the sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane. The story of a bridge where a handful of Georgians held off an entire Union corps. And the story of what it means when 23,000 human beings become casualties in 12 hours. If you want to understand the true horror and scale of the Civil War, you need to understand Antietam. If you love these stories that help us remember the human cost of war, I hope you will subscribe to our channel. We are building a community here to keep these memories alive. Now, let us go back to September of 1862, to a small town in Maryland where two armies were about to collide. Background. To understand why Antietam happened, you need to understand where the war stood in September of 1862. The Confederacy had been winning. For over a year, Confederate armies in Virginia had defeated or stalemated every Union offensive. First Bull Run. The Peninsula Campaign, Second Bull Run. Union generals had tried and failed to capture Richmond. Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, saw an opportunity. If he could take the war to Northern soil, if he could win a major battle in Union territory, it might break Northern will to continue the war. European powers might recognize the Confederacy. Lincoln might be forced to negotiate. In early September, Lee marched his army across the Potomac River into Maryland. He had about 40,000 men. They were veterans. They were confident. They were used to winning. The Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George McClellan, pursued. McClellan had about 75,000 men. He outnumbered Lee substantially, but McClellan was cautious, famously, obsessively cautious. He always overestimated enemy strength. He always wanted more men, more supplies, more time. Still, he moved north, and he got lucky. On September 13th, Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's orders wrapped around 3 cigars in an abandoned Confederate campsite. The orders showed that Lee had divided his army. Part of it was besieging Harper's Ferry. Part of it was marching north toward Pennsylvania. If McClellan moved fast, he could catch Lee's divided forces and destroy them one at a time. But McClellan did not move fast. He moved cautiously. He gave Lee time to realize his orders had been captured, time to concentrate his forces. By September 16th, Lee had gathered most of his army near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. His back was to the Potomac River. He had about 40,000 men. McClellan was approaching with 75,000. Lee should have retreated. He was outnumbered almost 2-1. His back was to a river which limited his ability to maneuver. But Lee was aggressive. Lee was confident. Lee believed his army could handle anything McClellan threw at them. He was almost right. Dawn, the Cornfield. The Battle of Antietam began at dawn on September 17th. The first fighting was in and around a cornfield on the northern edge of the battlefield. It belonged to a farmer named David Miller. It was about 30 acres of corn planted in neat rows, stalks standing 7 feet high. General Joseph Hooker's Union Corps attacked from the north. They had specific orders: break through the Confederate left, drive them from the field, cut off Lee's line of retreat. Over 10,000 Union soldiers advanced. They moved through the cornfield at dawn, using the corn for concealment. Confederate forces under General Stonewall Jackson were waiting. They were positioned in a woodline south of the cornfield with artillery in position. When the Union troops emerged from the corn, the Confederates opened fire. The killing was instant and devastating. Corporal Lewis Reed of the 12th Massachusetts later wrote, "I found myself on the ground with a strange feeling covering my body. My shirt and blouse filled with blood, and I supposed it was my last day on earth. I had the usual feelings of home and friends, and thousands of thoughts ran through my mind at once." Reed survived. 2 out of 3 men in his regiment did not. The 12th Massachusetts Infantry took 67% casualties that morning, the highest loss rate of any unit that day. But they kept coming. The Union forces pushed into the cornfield. Confederate forces counterattacked. The cornfield changed hands. Union reinforcements arrived. Confederate reinforcements arrived. For 3 hours, men fought in that cornfield. Artillery from both sides poured shells into it. Thousands of rifle bullets tore through the corn. The stalks were cut down by fire. The ground became thick with bodies. Park Ranger Keith Snyder, standing on the battlefield today, describes what happened. "The smoke, the noise, the artillery is crashing in from all directions. It's just a concentrated terror." By 9 in the morning, the cornfield had changed hands 15 times. Neither side controlled it. Both sides were exhausted, and both sides had suffered horrific casualties in 3 hours of fighting. The cornfield fighting alone accounted for over 8,000 casualties in 3 hours, in 30 acres. And it was only the beginning of the day. Mid-morning, bloody lay. As the fighting in the cornfield exhausted itself, the battle shifted south to the center of the battlefield. There was a sunken farm road between 2 fields. Over years of use, the road had worn down until it was 2 to 3 feet below the level of the surrounding ground. It made a perfect defensive position, a ready-made trench. Confederate forces under General D.H. Hill positioned themselves in the sunken road. They waited as Union forces advanced across the open fields. The Union attack began around 9:30 in the morning. Waves of soldiers in blue advanced toward the sunken road. They could not see the Confederates waiting there. The road was sunken, remember, hidden. When the Union troops got close, the Confederates rose up and fired. Men fell by the hundreds. The Union troops tried to return fire, but they were shooting at men in a trench. The Confederates had perfect cover. The Union forces fell back, regrouped, and attacked again. Same result. The Confederates in the sunken road could not be dislodged. This went on for hours. Charge, slaughter, retreat, charge, slaughter. Retreat, the Union forces began to bring up artillery. They positioned guns where they could fire down the length of the sunken road. Enfilade fire, the worst thing that can happen to troops in a trench. Cannonballs and canister shot tore through the Confederate lines. Men packed shoulder to shoulder in the trench were hit by the dozens. Still the Confederates held. Around 1 in the afternoon, a Union officer found a weak spot, a place where the Confederate line had been thinned by casualties. He pushed his men through. The Confederate line broke. The Confederates in the sunken road tried to retreat. Many were shot in the back as they ran. Many could not get out of the trench fast enough. They surrendered or were killed where they stood. When the fighting ended, the sunken road was filled with Confederate dead, stacked 2 and 3 deep in places. So many bodies that you could walk the length of the road stepping only on corpses. The survivors started calling it Bloody Lane. The fighting at Bloody Lane lasted from 9:30 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. 3.5 hours, about 5,600 casualties. Union 3,000, Confederate 2,600, and there was still half a day of fighting left. Afternoon, Burnside's Bridge. While thousands of men were dying at the cornfield in Bloody Lane, another drama was unfolding on the southern end of the battlefield. There was a stone bridge across Antietam Creek. It was called the Roebuck Bridge, but history remembers it as Burnside's Bridge. General Ambrose Burnside commanded the Union 9th Corps, positioned east of the bridge. His orders were to cross the creek, attack Lee's right flank, and drive the Confederates back against the Potomac River, but the bridge was a bottleneck. It was narrow, only wide enough for a few men to cross at a time. And on the other side, on high ground overlooking the bridge, were Georgian sharpshooters under General Robert Toombs, about 400 Georgians, facing an entire Union corps of over 12,000 men. But those 400 Georgians had a perfect defensive position. Anyone trying to cross the bridge was exposed, easy targets. The Georgians could fire down on them from cover. Burnside's first attack on the bridge began around 10 in the morning. Union troops charged the bridge. Georgian riflemen opened fire. Men fell on the bridge. The attack stalled. Burnside ordered another attack. Same result. For 3 hours, the Union forces could not cross that bridge. 400 Georgians held off 12,000 Union troops. Finally, at 12:30, Burnside tried a different approach. He promised 2 regiments, the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania, that if they took the bridge, he would restore their whiskey ration that had been recently canceled. The promise of whiskey succeeded where military discipline had failed. The 2 regiments charged the bridge, took heavy casualties, but pushed across. They captured a Confederate cannon and turned it on the Georgians. Confederate ammunition was running low. Toombs ordered a withdrawal. The Georgians had held that bridge for over 3 hours. They had cost the Union more than 500 casualties while losing fewer than 160 themselves. But now the bridge was open. Union forces poured across, 12,000 men advancing on the Confederate right flank. If they broke through, they would cut off Lee's retreat. The Confederate army would be destroyed. Lee had no reserves. His entire army was engaged. He had nothing to stop Burnside's advance. And then from the south, dust appeared on the road. Confederate reinforcements. General A.P. Hill's division arriving at a forced march from Harper's Ferry. They had covered 17 miles in 8 hours. Hill's men slammed into Burnside's flank. The Union advance stopped, then it reversed. Union troops fell back toward the bridge. By 5:30 in the afternoon, the fighting ended. Both armies were exhausted. Both had shot their ammunition. Both had spent everything they had, and they were basically in the same positions they had been at dawn. Nightfall, the aftermath. As the sun set on September 17th, soldiers from both armies collapsed where they stood. They had been fighting for 12 hours, longer than most workdays, 12 hours of continuous combat, of watching friends die, of loading and firing and loading and firing until their hands were black with powder and their ears rang with artillery concussion. 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing, more than at the 2-day Battle of Shiloh earlier that year. More than at any other single day in American history before or since. Union casualties, 12,410, including 2,108 dead. Confederate casualties, 10,316, including 1,547 dead. This represented 25% of the Union force and 31% of the Confederate force. Nearly 1 in 3 Confederates who fought that day was killed or wounded. Several generals were killed. Union generals Joseph Mansfield and Israel Richardson. Confederate generals Lawrence Branch and William Stark. Thousands of wounded men lay on the battlefield crying for help. Medics and stretcher bearers worked through the night, but there were too many. Men died waiting for care. Men died of shock and blood loss. Men died calling for water. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, was there. She tended the wounded so close to the fighting that a bullet went through her sleeve and killed a man she was treating. The next day, September 18th, both armies waited. Neither attacked. Lee expected McClellan to renew the assault. McClellan expected Lee to attack. Neither moved. That night, Lee withdrew across the Potomac. His invasion of the North was over. His army was safe, but his campaign had failed. McClellan did not pursue. Lincoln was furious. McClellan had won a tactical victory but failed to destroy Lee's army when he had the chance. Within weeks, Lincoln would remove McClellan from command. But the battle was a strategic Union victory. Lee's invasion had been stopped. The Confederate advance into Northern Territory had been turned back, and Lincoln had the victory he needed for what came next. Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory. He needed it for political reasons. He could not issue the Emancipation Proclamation after a defeat. It would look like desperation. He needed to issue it from a position of strength. Antietam, barely a victory though it was, gave him that strength. On September 22nd, 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be forever free. The proclamation changed the character of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. It gave the war moral weight. It made foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically impossible. Britain and France could not support a nation fighting to preserve slavery. The bloodiest day in American history led directly to the document that would free 4 million people. 23,000 casualties bought that opportunity. Lincoln took it. The human cost. But let us not forget the human cost in talking about political outcomes. 23,000 casualties is a statistic. It is hard for the human mind to grasp, so let me make it smaller. Imagine a town of 23,000 people, everyone you know, your entire community. Now imagine that in 12 hours, every single person in that town is either dead or maimed. That is what happened at Antietam, or think of it this way, nearly 2,000 casualties per hour, 32 per minute. One person killed or wounded every 2 seconds for 12 straight hours. These were not numbers. These were men, husbands, sons, brothers, fathers. Each one had a name. Each one had people who loved them. The town of Sharpsburg had about 1,300 residents. After the battle, there were 23,000 casualties lying in their fields and roads. 17 times the town's population. Every house became a hospital. Every barn was filled with wounded. The churches were hospitals. The schools were hospitals. There was nowhere that did not have wounded men. Farmers buried the dead in their fields, shallow graves, mass graves. Bodies were still being found decades later. A photographer named Alexander Gardner arrived 2 days after the battle. He took photographs of the dead still lying on the battlefield. They are some of the most haunting images of the Civil War: bodies in the cornfield, bodies at the sunken road, bodies piled like cordwood. These photographs shocked the nation. For the first time, civilians in the North saw what war actually looked like. Not glory, not heroism, just death. Reflection: the deadliest day. Friends, why do we remember Antietam? Not because it was a decisive Union victory. It was barely a victory at all. Lee escaped with his army intact, not because it ended the war. The war would continue for 2.5 more years. We remember Antietam because it showed the true cost of the Civil War. Because it was the day that Americans killed and wounded each other at a rate that has never been matched. D-Day, the Normandy invasion in World War II, was one of the bloodiest days in American military history. American forces took about 6,000 casualties. Antietam had 4 times as many casualties, and it was Americans killing Americans. The September 11th attacks killed nearly 3,000 people. A national tragedy that changed the course of American history. Antietam killed more than 3,000 in 12 hours and wounded 17,000 more. It is the deadliest single day in American history. More Americans became casualties at Antietam than on any other day before or since. And yet most Americans have never heard of it. We remember Pearl Harbor, we remember D-Day, we remember September 11th. We should also remember September 17th, 1862. Not because war should be glorified, but because the cost should never be forgotten. As we close today, I want you to picture that cornfield one more time. Dawn, September 17, 1862. 1,000 Union soldiers creeping forward through the corn, not knowing that in 3 hours, 2 out of 3 of them will be dead or wounded. The Georgians waiting, rifles ready, knowing what is coming, knowing they will have to kill as many men as they can before they themselves are killed. And then the moment when the Union troops emerge from the corn and the Georgians fire and the killing begins. For 12 hours, this scene played out across the battlefield. In the cornfield, at Bloody Lane, at Burnside's Bridge, thousands of men charging into fire, falling, dying, being replaced by more men who charged and fell and died. By nightfall, 23,000 men had vanished, not vanished into thin air, but vanished into death or injury so severe they would never be the same. The survivors would carry Antietam with them for the rest of their lives, in scars, in memories, in nightmares. In the faces of friends who never came home. September 17, 1862, the bloodiest day in American history. We should never forget it. We should never forget what it cost. We should never forget the 23,000 men who fell that day. Friends, if this story moved you, please share it. Antietam deserves to be remembered alongside Gettysburg and every other major battle of the Civil War. And tell me in the comments, had you heard of Antietam before? Did you know it was the single bloodiest day in American history? I read every comment and I learned so much from you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, keep their memory alive.